Welcome to today's special edition of the series Säulen der Demokratie, which is broadcast by the Chair of Political Philosophy, Theory and History of Ideas at the University of Regensburg in cooperation with Prefaktisch. Today we are at an international conference in Regensburg on John Rawls and the relevance of his deliberative theory of democracy in the age of digitization. I have the honor of speaking with two internationally renowned Rawls scholars. Both have also worked with him personally. Good afternoon, Sharon Lloyd and Paul Weithman. It's such a pleasure to have you here. Sharon, may I ask you first, what would you say is the particular relevance of John Rawls' political philosophy for today?
Well, today we find that democratic societies are not at all homogeneous in their populations, if ever they were. It's not as if now we see nations made up of single peoples who are all affirming the same religion, the same morality, the same political views. And in fact, now we have societies with a plurality of diverse views, some complementary, some competing. And the question is, how should we get along in the face of that? And I think what Rawls is able to do really uniquely has really given us many tools and formed the conversation for how to negotiate a modern, pluralistic, yet still liberal society, to make it possible to devise background institutions that can create a just social environment, a background structure against which individuals and groups can live the kinds of lives that they would find meaningful and valuable in security, and also with the sense that their views are respected and with the sense that they can be mutually respectful toward others in their society. So it's a very difficult project, but Rawls is the place to go for tools to do that.
Okay, thank you so much. Vielen Dank. I would now like to ask you, Paul, what would you say is the particular relevance of John Rawls' political philosophy for today?
First of all, thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me cite a couple of reasons why I think it's important for people to continue to study Rawls, and then a couple of reasons why I think his theory provides a useful ideal for us. Why is it useful to study Rawls? Well, for one thing, as Nozick said in his early reaction to Rawls's book, it's a really beautiful theory. It's carefully assembled, the parts fit together. Gaining an appreciation of the whole is really a wonderful thing. In that way, I think Rawls's book ranks, his first book, Theory of Justice, ranks with the work of political philosophy, but which Sharon has taught us so much, Hobbes's Leviathan. It's really a wonderful systematic work, and learning how a genius puts the engine together is really well worth doing for students. So one reason it's worth studying is just because of its beautiful systematic character. Another reason I think it's worth studying is because Rawls has done so much to set the agenda of contemporary political philosophy. Theory of Justice is now 50 years old. It's been the subject of an enormous amount of literature. It's generated an enormous amount of scholarly controversy. And yet nobody doubts that the questions that Rawls grappled with are among the most important questions in contemporary political philosophy. And nobody doubts that the concepts he introduced in order to study them, concepts of the basic structure, primary goods, the original position, autonomy, these are really central concepts in the study of political philosophy. You might in the end think that other concepts are more useful. There are other ways of measuring human well-being than primary goods that do better. But you have to start with Rawls, I think, and so that's a second reason it's worth studying. There are also a couple of reasons that I think Rawls provides an appropriate ideal for our time and continues to do so. One is that I think it's a really good antidote to two toxic tendencies in contemporary politics. One is the neoliberal hegemony that's grown up since Rawls published his book. And Rawls is a wonderful antidote to neoliberalism. He shows us what liberalism and democracy really entail, especially for the distribution of opportunity, income, and wealth. It stands in stark opposition to the neoliberalism of our time, and it's a wonderful ideal for that reason. Another, I think, is that, especially in his late work, Rawls came to see that is most likely society is going to stabilize around a family of conceptions of justice rather than just one. That seems to me a much more realistic, but unfortunately unexplored ideal. It's something that interests me greatly. And so I think figuring out what that ideal is, figuring out what the ramifications are of Rawls's affirmation of it, seeing how his theory has to be changed, really worth doing and can tell us a lot about the pluralistic societies in which we live.
My second question would be, what was John Rawls like as an academic teacher? What was unique about him for you?
Well, what was really unique about him for me was the fact that he was developing his own theory of justice and teaching it in real time, at the very same time that he was teaching us all the rest of political philosophy. So he would, for every lecture or class or seminar, he would handwrite out notes on his particular thinking at that time about his theory. When Paul and I were graduate students at Harvard, he was working on the ideas that became political liberalism, and also toward the end working in these ideas that became later justice as fairness, a restatement. So he would have these elements of his own theory, and then these would be integrated into whomever we were talking about. Were we talking about Mill or Kant or Hobbes or Locke? We're looking at some historical figure, but what we're seeing are the connections, the inheritance. We're also seeing how perhaps those earlier theories needed to be improved upon, and how this move that Rawls is working on is trying to improve on earlier thinkers. So this was one thing, is that you got a really vivid sense that you were living philosophy in real time. But the second thing is that he was so intensely engaged with the history of philosophy, history of moral philosophy, history of political philosophy. And all of his students were encouraged this 2-week word to really take seriously the historical figures. He thought of these as the greats, and as we studied them, he instilled in us a certain kind of attitude toward the treatment of history. He thought of it as a kind of charity in interpretation, but charity in interpretation really meant that you pay particular attention to the specific question that your historical figure is confronting in his own time, so that we don't just, amalgamate everybody's questions into some, singular meta question for all of political philosophy, and that we assume that this person is, a very sound mind, or else why are we spending our time reading them? And then when we find it so easy to criticize their views from our vantage point in history, we think again, but how was the problem as he saw it? What resources did he have available to answer it? And that we adopt a certain amount of humility. And this spills over into our own philosophizing, because you begin to think that when you see a problem in someone else, well, maybe the problem is really that you haven't fully understood what resources are available, you really didn't quite understand the problem as it was posed, and you begin to look harder, not for what would my solution to this be, but what would their solution be. And that, I think, really enriched the philosophy. I mean, if you look across generations of Rawls's students, I think you'll see that a lot of them have made really very good and deep contributions to our understanding of the history of political philosophy as well. And the last thing I would say about him was just that as a person, as busy as he was and as much in demand, he did seem to be able to care about the individual student. So, in my case, I had come from a background where I had studied only metaphysics and epistemology, and when I arrived at Harvard, I wanted to retool to learn political philosophy, but I didn't have much of an ear for it, which eventually he figured out. So about a year into my tenure there, he called me into his office and he sat me down and, with kindness, he said, you seem smart enough, but you don't really know anything. Tell me about yourself. So I said, well, you know, I did epistemology. He said, that's why you're not attending to the right sorts of questions. And he assigned me, a graduate student a couple of years ahead of me, to where I could go to when I read Locke or Rousseau and tell her what I was seeing of interest in it, and I could have her gently correct me, well, what about this, and what about this? And I thought that, you know, particular attention to his graduate students was really remarkable about, you know, a guy who might otherwise have been much too busy to care.
I think Rawls the teacher was very much Rawls the person, and Rawls the person was, I'd say, a personification of Rawls's theory. The theory is democratic, and Rawls himself was a kind of natural democrat. And this came through in his relations, I think, with his students, came through in his relations with his peers. It came through even in his management of his own career. He turned down the Kyoto Prize, which is worth $1 million, because he found out that in order to accept it, he'd have to bow to the emperor. He wasn't about to do that. A friend of ours, graduate school contemporary of ours, said to him one time, many years after graduate school, you know, Jack, you could win the Nobel Prize in economics. He said, I would turn it down. And he turned it down because he had to bow to the king in order to accept it. He was very much a democrat, and I think that suffused his life and suffused his teaching. He was, as you could guess from reading his book, a meticulous and careful thinker. And he was a meticulous and careful teacher and grader of work. Finally, he was, as you know from his theory, deeply committed to the value of autonomy. And so he was inclined to give his students the autonomy, the freedom to follow their interests where they led. That inevitably meant that some people got to know him a bit better than others. People whose interests overlapped his got to know him better than those who were working on other things at the time. One of my regrets about graduate school is that I didn't get to know him better because my interests took me further afield than it probably would have been wise to go. But for all that, he was willing to let me do it, and I'm very grateful for that.